Marlowe arrived at the observation deck at 6:47 a.m., 7 minutes before her scheduled arrival time. She had always been punctual, a quality she attributed to good organizational habits rather than any particular talent. The bay stretched before her in soft grey-blue dawn light, water rippling gently against the viewing glass. She set her tablet on the nearest console and moved toward the viewport, already mentally cataloguing the expected morning observations. The creature stopped moving at 6:48 a.m., not gradually, not in response to any stimulus she could identify. Simply all at once every dangerous species in the bay began retreating toward the structural walls. The Drail, territorial and aggressive, abandoned open water. The Vex hive dispersed from their usual feeding formations. The thornbacks that typically occupied the mid-level zones sank toward the lower walls, all of them moving in perfect, synchronized panic. Marlowe's pale blue-green eyes widened slightly. She pressed her hand against the glass, watching with the clinical detachment of a researcher observing unexpected data. She had arrived at 6:47. The movement had begun at 6:48. Correlation wasn't causation, but it was worth noting. Marlowe, Nexa's voice came from behind her. The deep purple-grey of his form was already moving toward the control panels, his cyan blue eyes glowing with an intensity that made his crystalline shoulder plates shimmer. "You shouldn't have come in early." She turned to look at him, genuinely puzzled. "The morning briefing is at 7. I'm never late. Is there a problem with the schedule?" Silas emerged from the secondary corridor, her warm amber-gold skin catching the first hints of sunlight. The golden bioluminescent freckles across her collarbone were pulsing steadily faster than Marlowe had ever seen them, a steady rhythm that seemed almost distressed. But her voice when she spoke was carefully controlled. "Marlowe, I need you to tell me something. How are you feeling this morning? Any unusual sensations? Any—" "I feel fine," Marlowe interrupted, glancing back at the bay. "But something's happening with the creatures. They've all moved to the walls simultaneously. That's not in any of our behavioral data. We should document." "Yes," Nexor said quietly, his cyan eyes never leaving his monitoring screens. "We should. But first I need you to stand very still and tell me if you notice any physical changes. Any tingling, any sense of being observed, anything unusual." Marlowe did as instructed, holding perfectly still. "Nothing unusual. My baseline measurements are normal. Why? What's happening?" Silas and Nexor exchanged a look, the kind of look that suggested a conversation happening in silence, a weight of understanding passing between them. Silas's golden freckles intensified their pulsing, shifting from gold to a deeper amber orange that Marlowe had never seen before. "The readings started showing anomalies approximately 90 seconds ago," Nexa said. His jaw was slightly clenched, and the crystalline plates on his shoulders shifted color cyan, bleeding into deeper, more troubled hues. "We were going to contact you, but then the creatures started retreating the moment she arrived," Silas finished quietly. She moved closer to Marlowe, her honey-brown eyes studying her with an intensity that felt almost clinical. "Has anything happened lately? Any exposure to unfamiliar specimens? Any unusual readings from your personal equipment?" "No," Marlowe said. "I followed all standard protocols. My last external observation was 4 days ago, and I showered and changed in the decontamination chamber like always." She paused, genuinely trying to be helpful. "Do you think I might have brought contamination into the facility because I can review the decontamination logs?" "That's not it," Silas said, but her golden freckles were still pulsing at that rapid, worried pace. "I don't think it's contamination." The observation deck's ambient lighting began to shift. Emergency indicators on the console flickered from soft blue to a more urgent amber. Marlowe registered this information with scientific interest but no particular alarm. "Are we initiating secondary monitoring protocols? Should I access the deeper water feeds?" "Yes," Nexor said, "but stay where you are. Don't move away from that viewport." Marlowe obeyed, watching as Nexor manipulated the console with practiced efficiency. The secondary monitoring systems activated, feeding data from sensors buried deep in the facility's lower levels. And what they showed made even Nexor's cyan blue eyes brighten with something that might have been fear. Pressure displacement, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. From directly beneath us, something large is rising. How large? Marlowe asked, already making calculations in her head. And what species? Does it match any of our— Nothing matches our catalogues, Silas interrupted. Her golden freckles had begun to glow so intensely that her entire skin seemed to radiate warmth. Marlowe, I need you to stand at the viewport. Right there. Don't move. This was unusual enough that Marlowe actually questioned it. Why? What does my position have to do with the pressure readings? Just trust me, Silas said. Please. Marlowe stepped closer to the viewport, her hand resting against the reinforced glass. Through it, the water appeared darker than usual, but that was expected during deep creature activity. She waited, watching, her researcher's mind engaged and alert but not frightened. This was data. This was what she had come to study. The facility trembled. Not violently, but with a deep, resonant quality that suggested something of extraordinary mass was moving through the water below them. Silas moved to stand beside Marlowe, close enough that Marlowe could feel the warmth radiating from her amber-gold skin. Nexor remained at the console, his crystalline plates glowing steadily brighter as he processed the incoming data. It's accelerating, he said. It's coming up. It's coming up fast. The creature wall, all those terrified species pressed against the structural supports, began to scatter. They moved not in the chaotic panic of individual fear, but in coordinated flight, clearing pathways as if making space for something vast to pass. The water began to churn with currents strong enough to be visible even from the observation deck. What is it? Marlowe whispered, not frightened, fascinated. What kind of organism could have this effect on apex predators? What could make them cooperate like this? I don't know, Silas said quietly. But I think it's responding to you. Marlowe turned to look at her. To me? How could it possibly? The creature rose into view. It was vast, it was impossible. It was something for which Marlowe had absolutely no reference frame, no categorical understanding, no biological precedent. It moved with a kind of controlled grace that belied its size, appendages or perhaps sensory organs, or perhaps structures that served purposes entirely unknown, extending through the water with deliberate slowness. And as it rose, the bioluminescence along its surface began to glow, casting the entire bay in shades of deep blue and violet that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal light wavelengths. And it was looking at them. Not at the facility. Not at the random collection of human and alien biology within it. At the viewport. At Marlowe specifically. Marlowe could feel the weight of that attention pressing against the glass with physical force, and she understood with a clarity that transcended logic or training that this creature had been drawn up from the depths by something, by some signature she was emitting, by some quality she possessed that had called to it across impossible distances. It knows you're here, Nexor said, his voice hollow with realization. Marlowe, I think you need to understand something. The readings we've been getting for the past 3 months, the anomalies in the deep water, the behavioral changes in the creatures, the disturbances in the seismic activity, they've all been centered on this facility. And they intensified the moment you transferred here. Marlowe couldn't look away from the viewport. The creature's bioluminescence was intensifying, casting brighter light through the water. She could see more detail, now structures that might have been eyes, or sensor arrays, or something that served purposes she couldn't comprehend. And all of them were focused on her. What am I? She asked quietly. I don't know, Silas said. But whatever you are, something in the deep ocean recognizes it, recognizes you. The facility trembled again. The creature rose closer until its massive form was level with the observation deck viewport. The water around it swirled with currents that made even the reinforced glass bow slightly inward. The creature stopped, hovering there, its full attention fixed on the small human woman standing alone at the viewport. And in that moment of absolute clarity, with an impossible entity pressing against the barrier between them and the void of the deep ocean, Marlowe did something that made both Silas and Nexor step back slightly. She raised her hand, she pressed her palm against the glass, and she knocked once, gently, like asking permission to enter a room. A pause stretched across that barrier of glass and water and incomprehensible distance. Then the creature responded. A vibration through the water, a movement so subtle it could have been current, but there unmistakably against the viewport, something vast and impossible pressed back. Once, in the exact rhythm Marlowe had initiated, Nexa's crystalline plates flared bright cyan. Silas's golden freckles erupted into near-blinding intensity, but neither of them moved to stop what was happening. Marlowe pressed her hand against the glass again, once, waiting. The response came, once, patient, deliberate, not curiosity recognition. This creature knew something about her, had perhaps been searching for her, had perhaps been drawn across impossible distances by the mere fact of her existence. Again, Marlowe's hand, once. Again. The creature's response, once. And beneath that single contact, Marlowe felt something that transcended language or species or biological compatibility. A moment of connection. An acknowledgement, a greeting from something ancient and vast to something small and inexplicable. The third exchange began. Marlowe's hand, once. The fourth exchange, the creature's response, once. And then, slowly, the vast form began to descend, not in retreat, but in what felt like deliberate withdrawal. The bioluminescence faded. The water cleared. The pressure readings returned to baseline. The creature sank back into the depths from which it had risen, taking with it the weight of its attention, leaving Marlowe standing at the viewport with her hand still pressed against cooling glass. The emergency lighting shifted back to standard operational levels. The facility settled into quiet. And Marlowe, who had come to work 7 minutes early and had somehow attracted the attention of something vast enough to terrify every known predator in the ecosystem, simply stood there, calm, serene, completely oblivious to the fact that she was something rare, something the deep ocean had recognized and chosen to acknowledge. Behind her, Silas and Nexor exchanged glances. There were conversations that needed to happen, questions that needed answering. An understanding that the small human woman who had transferred to their facility 3 months ago was not what she appeared to be. But those conversations could wait. For now, they simply watched as Marlowe lowered her hand from the glass, checked the time on her wrist, and turned back toward them with an expression of serene curiosity. "So," she said, her voice perfectly calm, "are we still having the 7 briefing, or should we reschedule?" The control room sat isolated 3 levels above the observation deck, accessible only through a series of sealed bulkheads that had locked automatically the moment the emergency protocols activated. Marlowe stood between Nexa and Lixa, watching as Silas moved between monitoring stations, her golden freckles pulsing with controlled intensity. The massive creature had descended approximately 12 minutes ago. Since then, nothing. Perfect silence, perfect stillness, perfect unknowing. "The pressure readings are stable," Nexa said, his cyan blue eyes tracking data across the primary console. "Baseline normal. Whatever it was, it's returned to depth." "But it was here," Lixa whispered. The junior researcher's pale lavender skin had become noticeably more translucent, her 4 amethyst eyes locked in synchronized wideness that suggested she was still processing what had occurred in the observation deck. Her internal glow had shifted from calm lavender to bright white, the color of pure fear. "I felt it, even from down here in the secondary monitoring station. I felt it like pressure against my consciousness." "What was that?" No one answered her, because the truth, which all 3 of them understood, was that they had no answer. They had no reference frame for what they had just witnessed. A creature of impossible size. A creature that recognized something about Marlowe that transcended normal biology. A creature that had chosen communication over attack. "Silas," Nexor said quietly, "I need you to run a complete genetic analysis on Marlowe." Silas looked up from her monitoring station, her honey-brown eyes meeting his cyan blue ones. "You think she's not human?" "I think," Nexor said carefully, "that she might be human, but not in the way we understand the term." Marlowe, who had been calmly reviewing the data feeds from the observation deck incident, looked between them with genuine confusion. "You want to run genetic analysis? Why? I'm human." Standard baseline human genetics. I can provide my medical records if—" "Later," Silas said gently. She moved closer to Marlowe, her golden freckles pulsing at a steady, almost maternal rhythm. "I think the more pressing question is, do you remember anything unusual from before you transferred here? Any anomalies in your own biology? Any reason you might have been assigned to this particular facility?" Marlowe considered this carefully. "I applied for the position because the research data was interesting. The Bay ecosystem is complex, and I wanted to contribute to the documentation protocols. Beyond that, I don't recall anything unusual. My transfer was processed through normal channels. My background checks all cleared. But you arrived 3 months ago," Lixor said, her voice still small and frightened. "And, according to Nexor's data, the anomalies in the deep water started 3 months ago. Exactly when you arrived." Marlowe processed this information with scientific detachment. "Correlation isn't necessarily causation. However, if there's a temporal relationship, it would be worth investigating." The facility trembled, not violently, but with enough force to suggest something massive was moving directly beneath their location. Lixor made a sound small, frightened, completely involuntary. Her 4 eyes synchronized in rapid succession, blinking shut and open in sequence, and when they remained open, her body had become even more translucent, her internal glow flickering between white and the faintest lavender. "It's coming back," Nexor said, studying the pressure readings with intense focus. "It didn't leave, it descended, but it's still in the facility's lower water column, and it's beginning to ascend again." "Why would it come back?" Marlowe asked, not panicked, not even particularly concerned, simply interested in the logical progression of events. "Because," Silas said slowly, "you're here." The basement levels of the facility weren't designed for human habitation. They existed in perpetual darkness, illuminated only by the bioluminescence of the creatures that inhabited the deep water channels. The monitoring equipment there was sophisticated enough to detect pressure changes, thermal variations, and movement patterns, but it had been designed with the assumption that the primary threats would be known species with catalogued behaviors. Nothing had prepared them for this. The creature rose through the lower water columns, like an ascending god of the deep. The pressure sensors went wild with readings that suggested something so vast that the very water around it was being displaced by orders of magnitude beyond normal. And then it reached the facility's outer walls, and it stopped. For a moment, one eternal moment, it simply pressed against the structure, as if testing its solidity. And in that moment, Marlowe felt something. Not a physical sensation, but something deeper. A reaching out. A question posed in a language that predated human speech. A query directed specifically at her consciousness. "It's trying to communicate," she said quietly. "Yes," Nexor confirmed. His crystalline shoulder plates had begun cycling rapidly through shades of cyan bright, then dim, then bright again, like a strobe of existential distress. "But we don't have the tools to understand it. The communication patterns don't match any known linguistic structure. It's almost as if the pressure readings spiked. And suddenly, Marlowe understood, not through any external input, but through something deep within her own biology, something that she had never been aware of until this moment. Responding to the creature's outreach, she understood what it was asking. She understood what it had been searching for. She understood, with a clarity that felt like remembering rather than learning, exactly what she was. She understood what it was asking. She had no words for what she understood about herself in that moment. Perhaps words weren't the right tool for it. "I need to go to the observation deck," Marlowe said. "Absolutely not," Nexor said immediately. His cyan eyes blazed with intensity. "Marlowe, do you understand what's happening? That creature is not a known species. Its behavior is not predictable. The pressure it's exerting on the facility's lower sections is already at maximum safe tolerances. If we open any external bulkheads, it won't attack," Marlowe said. She said it with certainty, with knowledge that transcended logic. "It came here because it recognized something in me. It wants to understand what I am, just as I want to understand what it is." "How do you know that?" Silas asked, her golden freckles suddenly pulsing with urgent, almost fearful intensity. I just do, Marlowe said. The same way you knew to place me at that viewport. The same way the creatures knew to retreat when I arrived. We're all responding to the same signal, the same presence, the same fundamental truth about what I am. Lixa's entire body flickered. Her translucence increased to the point where her internal crystalline structures were barely distinguishable, and her four eyes, all synchronized in their expression of overwhelming fear, locked onto Marlowe with desperate intensity. Please don't go, please. We don't know what it wants. We don't know what it could do to you. Marlowe moved to Lixa and placed a gentle hand on her translucent shoulder. The junior researcher's lavender skin was cool to the touch, her trembling barely contained. I have to, Marlowe said quietly, because unlike all of you, I'm not afraid of it. And that difference, that absence of fear, might be the only language it understands. Lixor's four eyes met hers in perfect synchronization. That, she whispered, is what frightens me most about you. The journey through the sealed bulkheads back to the observation deck took longer than Marlowe expected. Each barrier required manual override, each passage a deliberate choice to move deeper into connection with something vast and unknown. Nexor followed her, his cyan glowing eyes tracking every reading, every pressure change, every indication of the creature's position and movements. He didn't try to stop her again. Perhaps he understood, on some level, that stopping her was impossible. Perhaps he recognized that she was moving towards something she had no choice but to encounter. When they reached the observation deck, the viewport had cracked further, not from pressure, but from the sheer weight of presence pressing against it from the other side. The creature was there, vast and beautiful and utterly impossible, its bioluminescence casting the entire bay in shades of deep blue that seemed to come from dimensions beyond normal perception. Its form was so immense that Marlowe could only process it in sections, a curve of something that might have been a limb, the suggestion of structures that might have been sensory organs, shapes that defied simple categorization. And it was looking at them, not at the facility, not at the random collection of human and alien biology within it, at the viewport, at Marlowe specifically. A knowing passed between them, an acknowledgement older than words, older than species, older than the very concept of communication as humans understood it. Silas arrived then, moving quickly but carefully through the observation deck doors. Her golden freckles were pulsing at a rhythm that suggested she had run. Her honey-brown eyes held understanding now, not full understanding perhaps, but enough. Enough to recognize that something profound was happening, something that transcended the normal parameters of their research and their facility, and their carefully ordered understanding of the world. The creature began to descend. But this time, it wasn't a retreat, it was an acceptance, an acknowledgement that it had found what it had been searching for, even if that something couldn't fully follow it into the depths. As it descended, its bioluminescence slowly dimmed, the colors shifting from brilliant blue through purple and indigo until it faded entirely into the darkness of the abyss. The water returned to its normal state. The facility's emergency systems powered down their highest alert levels. The pressure readings returned to baseline. The bay became still. Marlowe removed her hand from the viewport, and in that moment of lowering her palm, she felt the last whisper of the creature's consciousness withdrawing into the deep, but it left something behind. Not a physical mark, but a knowing, an understanding that she was not alone in being strange. That somewhere in the vast darkness beneath every ocean on every world, there were things that recognized her as kin. She turned to find Silas standing behind her, her golden freckles now pulsing at a gentle, almost resigned rhythm. Nexor was there too, his crystalline plates glowing at a steady, almost peaceful cyan. What was that? Silas asked quietly. Communication, Marlowe said. It recognized something in me, something I didn't know was there until it reached out. What happens now? Nexor asked. Will it come back? No, Marlowe said. She could feel the truth of it with absolute certainty. The creature had completed its search. It had confirmed what it needed to confirm. The deep ocean knew she was here, and it was satisfied with that knowledge. There was no need for it to return. They stood together at the viewport as the sun continued its rise, painting the bay in shades of normal blue and grey. The creatures that had retreated to the walls were slowly returning to their normal patterns, swimming through water that was no longer marked by the presence of the impossible. The facility settled into something resembling routine, though nothing would ever truly be routine again. By the time the external seals had been fully restored and the all-clear signal confirmed, it felt as if the morning's events had never happened. The bay was calm. The facility was secure. And Marlowe, who had arrived at 6:47 a.m. to begin a normal day of research, had instead encountered something vast enough to reshape her understanding of what she was. She carried that knowledge with her like a secret, like a gift, like a burden she didn't yet fully comprehend. The observation deck was quiet when they finally made their way back there after all the secondary checks had been completed. The morning briefing had been postponed indefinitely. The emergency protocols were standing down, and the handful of personnel who had remained behind during the evacuation were reviewing the incident reports with expressions of carefully managed confusion, trying to categorize and explain something that defied all explanation. Marlowe walked to the viewport one final time, looking out at the peaceful water. Somewhere in those depths, the creature was descending back to wherever it came from, back to whatever existence beings of that magnitude inhabited, carrying with it the knowledge that there was something on the surface, something small and human-shaped, that shared a fundamental nature with the ancient intelligences of the abyss. So, Marlowe said, turning to look at Silas and Nexor, who had followed her back to the viewport. Lixor was still in the control room, reviewing the final sensor data, her trembling finally subsiding. "Are we rescheduling the 7 briefing, or should I begin my preliminary data analysis?" Silas's golden freckles pulsed one more time, not with panic now, but with something almost like affection for the beautifully, impossibly oblivious woman standing before them. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if summoning patience from somewhere deep within her warm amber gold form. "Schedule the briefing," Silas said finally. "But Marlowe, we're going to need to talk about your background, your actual background, not what's in the official records." "Of course," Marlowe said calmly. "I'm curious about that myself now. There's clearly a connection between my presence and the deep water anomalies. We should investigate the mechanism, run the genetic analysis, review my personnel file, establish a timeline of events, and see if we can identify the causal relationship." "Yes," Nexor said quietly. "We'll do all of that." And with that, Marlowe moved back to her workstation, retrieved her tablet, and began organizing her notes on the morning's unusual creature behavior. She made careful observations about the timing, the pressure readings, the behavioral patterns of the species that had retreated to the walls. She documented everything with scientific precision, completely unaware that she had just encountered the reason the deep ocean had been calling to her across the months of her presence, completely unaware that she was something rare enough to fascinate entities older than human civilization itself, completely unaware that somewhere in the abyss, in the crushing darkness where light itself became meaningless, something ancient and vast now carried the memory of her hand against glass, her singular response to a question posed in a language older than words, and completely unbothered by any of it, because Marlowe, in the end, was exactly what she appeared to be, a researcher dedicated to her work. The fact that the work had suddenly become exponentially more complicated was, to her, merely another data point to document, another mystery to catalogue, another puzzle to solve with the methodical, patient dedication she brought to everything she encountered. She simply worked. And the facility around her hummed with the quiet intensity of people who had witnessed something that would reshape their understanding of the universe itself, all while one person continued calmly documenting its details as if it were no more unusual than any other morning in a research facility by the bay. The water outside remained still. The creatures went about their lives, and somewhere in the depths, something ancient and vast settled back into its eternal slumber, satisfied that its question had been answered, that its search had reached completion, that the bridge between worlds it had recognized had been confirmed. The rest of humanity, Marlowe included, simply went on with their work, completely unaware of how close they had come to something that transcended understanding itself.